Okay, guys. So today we're starting the third of three forms of argument that we're talking about this semester. These are what I'll just generally call IBE arguments, or inferences to the best explanation, or moral IBEs. And once we're done with this week, right, we'll look at some types of articles next week that apply this form of argument. But then from then on, we're just talking about different issues within ethics. Okay? We're not leaving these arguments behind. We're going to come back and look at some of them. We'll look at all of them eventually to varying degrees. But it'll be more kind of topical and issue focused. Okay? But we don't want to forget kind of that ethics is about making these kinds of arguments. It's about giving reasons for the positions that we take. So we're going to be focusing on reasons and counter arguments as much as we will on particular issues. Okay, so an IBE argument is a kind of argument that is used in ethics, but it's also used in other fields and disciplines, even in our everyday lives. Right? So these are common types of arguments in science. And it's an argument that tries to draw conclusions based on the best evidence that we have available to us. Right? So, if I leave a room at home, let's leave the living room, I've got a can of Coke on the table, and my daughter's in the room and she likes to play pranks on me. And when I come back, she's kind of laughing to herself and the can of Coke is gone, right? I might, on the basis of all of that evidence, think that she has hidden my Coke from me, okay? Or if I come home from work today, I hope this doesn't happen, and I find that my living room window is open and there is mud on the sofa's up by the window, and on the floor, and there are footprints that lead over to where my TV is, but the TV is gone, okay? On the basis of all of that evidence, what might I conclude?
Somebody broke into your house.
Somebody broke into my house and stole my TV. Is it possible that there's some other explanation?
Yes.
Possible. But that would be a reasonable explanation and conclusion to come to, okay? So these IBE arguments are forms of what we call inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is contrasted with deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is reasoning that tries to kind of prove beyond any doubt, prove with certainty a particular conclusion, right? So if we say something like all people are mortal and Socrates is a man, then it has to be the case, right? If these two premises are true, then it can't be the case that Socrates is anything but mortal, okay? But if I flip a light switch, right? If I flip this light switch, if I flip this switch, what am I gonna expect to happen? Some of these lights, it'll be this bank of lights here on the far side of the room, I think, yeah. But those lights will turn off, okay? Now if I turn a set of lights off and I flip the switch again, what's gonna happen? They'll turn back. Is that necessarily true? Is it possible they won't turn back on? Yeah, right? So that's a form of inductive argumentation, right? We're drawing a conclusion based on our experiences and observation of the world, about what we expect to happen, what's probably the case, right? It probably is the case that I've flipped the switches and flip them back on. The lights will go off and then come back on. But it's possible that a light might burn out, or there might be a wiring issue, a short or something, and lights won't come back on, okay? And so when we make inductive arguments, we're making arguments that whose conclusion have a high degree of probability, but is not absolutely certain, okay? Inductive arguments are this kind of argument. They're based on observations and conclusions that we draw on the basis of observations. In a moral IBE, okay, things get a little bit complex because there are two parts to a moral IBE. Okay, they're a little more complex than your standard IBE about, concluding that somebody has stolen your TV because there's mud on the floor and on the sofa. In a moral IBE, we use that kind of inferential, gosh, why is that so hard to say? We use the inferential reasoning in one part of the argument, namely the first part, the principal justification subargument. And then we use the principle that we come to in that first subargument in the second part, and it's just a traditional argument from principle. So the principal application argument, subargument, is just a standard kind of argument from principle. Okay? So let's look at what this might look like. So on pages 174 and 75, there's a case that is discussed about Dr. Bookish and a student, Janice, and another student, Precarity. And Precarity has asked Janice to help give some cheating help, and Janice is uncertain about whether or not, I don't know if it's a he or she, should help. Okay, so Janice goes to Dr. Bookish. And Dr. Bookish says, well, let's think about some other cases in which somebody might cheat and see if we can come up with a principle that could guide us, because some cases of cheating are going to be impermissible, some cases of cheating might be permissible. We need to come up with a principle that captures what makes those various cases right or wrong, and then see if and how that principle might apply to your case with Precarity. Okay? And so they consider various situations that seem to offer unambiguous judgments or conclusions about the rightness or the wrongness of cheating. Right? So a doctor who is dealing some sort of, I don't remember, what is it? Is it a performance-enhancing drug? Let's see. Just a moment. Yeah, a football player. Yes. So the dope-dealing doctor deals performance-enhancing drugs to a football player. Or no, I'm sorry, prescribes drugs that ban performance-enhancing drugs. Okay. In the election hacker, right, a computer hacker modifies voting machines to guarantee that an unpopular politician wins election. Okay. And the hacker believes it's going to be better for the state if that politician wins. But the politician can't win without cheating. And in the unjust draft dodger, right, you have somebody who is seeking to hack a computer that runs a draft to ensure that members of a certain oppressed minority won't be drafted. And so we have this unjust situation. It's this dystopian society, and this person is trying to ensure that certain members are not subjected to further injustice. Okay. So once they look at all these cases, they try to identify a principle that can account for those various judgments. Okay? So if we put that sub-argument, the principal justification sub-argument, in standard form, it'll look something like this, right? So in 1 and 2, I have kind of what's the word I'm looking for? The what you're basically doing there, and then with the actual case here in parentheses. Okay, so we want to say that the cases that we are looking at, the paradigm cases, have a certain moral status. In this case, we're likely to judge that two of these cases have one sort of moral status and the other has another. So the suggestion here is that we would see what the dope dealing doctor and the election hacker are doing is wrong, while the person who is trying to hack the unjust draft would be permissible. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. In the second premise of the principal justification subargument, we try to explain what accounts for these judgments. Okay, so in some cases, right, this first premise, the judgment about all the paradigm cases will be the same. In other cases, you might have one judgment about one or more cases and another judgment about, contrasting judgment about the other cases. Right? But in any case, in premise 2, we want to try to explain those judgments, whether they're the same for all the paradigm cases or there's some differences there. Okay. And what we might say here is that the best explanation of the cases in premise 1 is that aiding and cheating is morally permissible, right, only if it's necessary to counteract a serious injustice. Right? So helping the unpopular politician win through cheating and helping the football player avoid getting caught using performance-enhancing drugs, right? Neither of those is a case of cheating that is meant to counteract an injustice, but the cheating in the third case is meant to counteract an injustice. And so the idea here is that that would help to explain the difference. Okay? So we would say then that helping others cheat is morally permissible only if it's necessary to counteract a serious injustice. Okay? So a few things here. First premise, we're just kind of laying out what the moral status of the paradigm cases at hand are. Okay? In the second premise, we're trying to account for the judgments that we have about the paradigm cases. And then the conclusion in the principal justification subargument is simply going to be a restating as a moral principle the explanation that we've given in premise 2, right? So if you look at it, right, the best explanation of all the cases in premise 1 is that aiding and cheating is morally permissible only if it is necessary to counteract a serious injustice. Okay, that's your explanation of those cases. And the principle is the conclusion. The conclusion, which is the principle that you'll use in the second part of the argument, is simply a restatement of that explanation in premise 2. So helping others cheat is probably permissible or morally permissible. I don't know why I said probably. Only if it's the only way to counteract serious injustice. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So that's the first part of an IBE argument, a moral IBE argument. What we're doing in the second part is we're just going to apply that principle as we would in a moral, an argument from principle. Okay? So the original case was whether it's okay for precarity to help, Janice to help precarity to cheat. Okay? So the first premise of the principal application subargument is just going to be a repeat of the conclusion of the principal justification subargument, because that was a principle that you came up with. So you're going to restate it as the first premise because that's a principle, right? So helping others cheat is permissible only if it's necessary to counteract serious injustice. Okay? In this case, helping precarity cheat it has nothing to do with injustice. Okay, so helping precarity cheat is not necessary to counteract serious injustice. So the conclusion to the argument as a whole is that helping precarity to cheat is not permissible. Okay, so think about it this way. We have a question about what we should do. Okay, that has to do with a certain kind of behavior. Okay? And then we're looking at other cases of action that have to do with, other instances of that behavior. Okay, and we're trying to look at how these cases might help us to understand the thing that's in question. Okay? Does that make sense? Does that make sense? We're going to do a little practice. We're going to start on the homework today, so I hope this will start making more sense as we go along. I had a sense that in my 9 o'clock class, folks were having, I don't know if it was me or the material, but weren't getting it quite as well as I was hoping. So we'll do plenty of practice, and hopefully that'll help. Okay, when we evaluate IBE arguments, we can focus on either the principal application subargument or the principal justification subargument. If we're looking at the principal application subargument, we're doing the same things that we do when we're evaluating an argument from principle as we've looked at before. So I'm not going to talk about that. In an IBE argument, we'll often focus on the principal justification subargument. So we might say one of two things. We might say that we haven't really chosen the best paradigm cases. The first premise is going to be weak if we've chosen cases that are controversial, that don't elicit the same judgment from people. Okay, we want to choose they're paradigm cases because they're paradigms of the kind of behavior at issue. But if they're cases that don't elicit the same kind of response from most people, they're not going to serve as very good bases for deriving a moral principle. Okay. So our cases shouldn't have moral judgments attached to them that are controversial. It should be a fairly clear judgment that most people will agree with. Secondly, the principle that we come up with, or the explanation that precedes the principle, may not be the best explanation of those cases. Okay? So there's another way of explaining the cases than is offered, in the argument that better captures what makes the judgment, right or wrong or whatever it might be. Then there's a problem with that explanation. Okay, so we want our explanation to explain the paradigm cases as well as or better than any other competing explanation. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, so let's look at, that's it for that. Let's look at some exercises. Let's look at 11A. So who does not have a book available to them, either in print or on their computer? Who doesn't have a book? If you don't have your book with you, maybe get together with somebody who has it so you can see what we're looking at. So if you have to move, that's fine.
Which book is this in?
The yellow one,
Is that the college?
Doing Practical Ethics. 185. So we'll just work through the first 5 here. That should be about all the time we have, I think. If things go, yeah, they're going about as quickly as they did last class. All right. So in 11A, right, we're supplying the missing premise or the conclusion so that the argument fits the pattern of the principal justification subargument of an IBE. Okay, so here we don't have whole IBEs. right? We just have the first part of IBEs for each of these things. Okay? We're just looking at paradigm cases, providing explanations of those paradigm cases, and then deriving a principle. Okay? So in number 1, the paradigm cases are, we have a firefighter who's opposed to abortion and who refuses to put out a fire at an abortion clinic. And the second paradigm case is it's often the case that you'll have 3, 4, or more paradigm cases. So just having a couple here is not necessarily, what you're commonly going to encounter. In fact, it's probably better to have a handful of paradigm cases, because if you've just chosen a couple very selectively, you're not going to get the best principle. Okay, it's going to be problematic if you've just chosen paradigm cases that are going to lead to a certain principle. Okay, so we have a vegan burger slinger, a line cook at Double Meat Palace who recently converted to veganism, refuses to prepare or serve meat, although that was what they were hired to do. Okay, so what we want to think here is whether we think that the actions of these individuals is permissible or impermissible, or whether or not it would be permissible or impermissible for these individuals to be punished or fired by their employers. Okay? So can the actions of these individuals be justified? Or not? What do we think? It's, huh?
For them, yeah. It's justified for them because it's like against what they thought, but it's not justified.
Okay, what would you say to somebody whose job requires them to do something that they're opposed to? If your job requires you to, do you like puppies?
Yeah.
If your job required you to perform medical experiments that cause pain to puppies, what would you probably do? Would you say you want to keep the job but not do the experiment? Or would you probably try to find another job? What would you guys do? Puffin, I hope this isn't traumatizing to you. I'm sorry.
I was like, it kind of depends on what the goal of that experiment is.
Well, that might well be the case.
And if it's like a one-time experiment, or if it's going to be consistently. I'd probably talk to the employer and try and figure out.
But if it was something that was a consistent requirement of the job, or it could be the vegan burger slinger working at Double Meat Palace is not going to not cook meat, right?
Yeah.
So what would that person probably be advised to do?
Probably quit.
Probably be advised to find another line of work, right? Because they can't do their job and maintain that position at the same time. Okay? Now you might say that, well, there's a problem with the job, which is fine, right? There might be. Okay, so are we going to have the same judgment about both of these people? Or about what their employers can do because they're refusing to do their jobs? Okay, yeah, so we might say something like, firefighters and vegan burger slingers employers should be allowed to punish them for refusing to do their jobs. Okay. And then the second premise would, the best explanation of those cases is that an employee does not have a right to be protected from punishment by their employer if they refuse to do a task that's part of their job description. And then the conclusion, which will be the principle that we end up working with, is so an employee does not have a right to be protected from punishment by their employer if they refuse to do a task that is part of their job description. Okay, whatever the case is at hand that this argument would be part of probably has something to do with an employee who is not willing to do something related to their job. Okay? So then when you go to the principal application sub-argument, you're going to begin with that principle that served as the conclusion for the justification sub-argument. Okay? And that we can't go any further because we don't know what the broader case is, but that's how you would progress afterwards. Okay. So in number 2, we have 2 paradigm cases. We have the 2 premises, but we're missing the conclusion. So first case is the tragic prognosis case. A physician discovers that a patient has a serious and debilitating illness for which there is no treatment. The patient is competent to understand the prognosis and has said that they want to know the truth no matter how disheartening it is. The doctor worries that the truth is too painful and wonders if they should hide the results from the patient. Okay, and then in the second case, it's a case called business trouble. We have A and B, who are business partners. A has found out that their business is about to be sued. B cannot do anything about the lawsuit. The lawyers will take charge of that. Okay. So even though A and B have agreed to discuss any matters impacting their business, A worries that telling B the bad news will be stressful for B and won't benefit the business. Okay. So premise 1, the doctor in tragic prognosis and the person A in business trouble should not hide the truth. Okay, does that seem like reasonable judgments about those 2 cases? That in both cases withholding the truth or hiding the truth is wrong? Okay? So the best explanation, premise 2 of the cases in premise 1 is that it's wrong to hide the hurtful truth from someone if they're competent to understand the truth and it concerns a project that's important to them. So the conclusion would be that would then serve as the premise, the principle as the first premise, and the next part of the argument would be what?
You shouldn't hide the truth from people no matter how hurtful it may be.
No, not necessarily. That's a little too broad. So stick to the explanation in premise 2. So we would say something like, it's wrong to hide hurtful truths from someone if they can understand the truth and it concerns a project important to them. Really, the conclusion is going to more or less just repeat the explanation. Okay? All right. In number 3, the paradigm cases are grandparental misdeeds and the bike thief. So in the first one, Seamus's grandfather stole a bike from Yee's grandmother. The bike was lost ages ago. Seamus has never seen it himself, and Yee was not disadvantaged by her grandmother's loss of the bike. Okay. Okay, so we have 2 people in that first one whose grandparents were part of a situation where a bike was stolen, but neither of those individuals had anything to do with the stealing, and neither of them has benefited or been harmed by it. Okay, second case, the bike thief. Megan stole Javier's bike, which he had worked hard to buy. She sold the bike for a tidy sum. Okay. Are we going to have different judgments about those 2 paradigm cases or the same judgment? And what would the judgment or judgments be?
They're going to be different.
Okay. So one's going to be a negative judgment. One's going to say it was okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Which one are we going to have the problem with?
Bike people?
The bike thief. Okay. So we might want to say that, what would we want to say for the second case?
That's the one. That's the bike thief one. Correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What are we going to say about Megan and Javier? That Megan has to do what?
Pay Javier for bike.
Yeah.
Give him back the bike.
Yeah, pay reparations or compensation in some way, okay? But, right, in the case of Seamus and Yee, what happened between their grandparents has had no bearing on them. They have no knowledge of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we would probably say Seamus is not morally obliged to pay compensation to Yi for his grandfather's misdeeds. Or grandfather's misdeeds. Okay? So the conclusion here is going to be what?
Person X only owes person Y reparations if person X,
Yeah.
person Y was wrong. X.
If person X, wrong person.
It's hard
So
to do it without names. 'Cause it's like,
you could do it like this. One person is obligated to compensate another person only if the first person wronged the second person, right? Or only if that person is responsible for the wrongs that were done. Okay? All right, number 4. All right, so we have 2 cases of people being affected by speech in a college setting. First case, classroom abuse, college student A. Okay, we're going to call him Albert, and we're going to call the other one Brian. No, not Albert. What's a good A name? Aaron. Okay, so we got Aaron and Brian. We'll do Aaron and Brian because you're right, Brooks. Names are better than letters. Okay, so Aaron spends 10 minutes before class openly berating Brian, explaining why he thinks that Brian is a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad person. Okay, anybody know what that's a reference to?
I've heard it, but I can't remember.
Come on, somebody's got to know this.
Not Home Alone, is it?
Nope. It's a book. Actually, it was made into a movie too. Kid's book. Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. You guys read that as a kid? No? Nobody knows that book?
I don't know. The bald kid? Is he like bald?
I don't think he was bald.
No.
No, yeah, he
Yeah, he
was.
was.
Yes,
Was he bald?
Yeah,
He
exactly.
looked like a Rugrat.
Yeah.
Okay.
The main
I
character.
don't remember.
I think. I don't know.
I remember reading the book. My daughter had it.
He had like sharp, pointy teeth.
Yeah.
And at the end, he decided he was going to move to Australia.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, okay. So Aaron tells Brian why Brian is such a horrible person, and Brian feels unwelcome in the classroom, and he leaves. The other students in the classroom are upset by what they have seen, and they struggle to pay attention in the class session. Okay. Second case is the lunchroom offense. During lunch at the college cafeteria, a few friends are discussing their views about religion. They agree that organized religions are harmful, and they offer to each other many examples from history and current events to support their view. Another student who is devoutly religious overhears their conversation and is offended. The offended student could easily move to another part of the lunchroom so they don't have to hear the other student's discussion, but they chose not to. Okay, so what is the kind of behavior that's at issue here?
I would say the kid's talking about all religions are bad. Or religion.
Okay, so we have somebody whose speech has caused offense. Okay. In the second case, is it speech is it speech that is at issue in the first case too?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it has to do with Aaron's berating of Brian. Okay. What might we do with regard to speech that offends or harms people?
Man.
Regulated or limited in some way, prohibit it, okay? We're going to be more inclined to prohibit one of these forms of speech than the other? Or are we going to have the same judgments?
Attacking somebody like in a classroom, especially like uncalled for. But if you're just having an open discussion and somebody just decides to jump in your conversation, it's like 2 different things.
Okay.
I think too, it's not even necessarily about what you say all the time, as is how you say it and the manner you go about it.
Okay. Sure.
Because I feel like a lot of people And like, he's right, like, there's like times when people can jump right in the middle of a conversation, and it's like, they don't necessarily know like the tone you're talking about the
Okay.
situation in, and that can become misconstrued pretty easily,
Okay.
but, I don't know, I feel like neither one is permissible.
All right, so in a classroom setting, people might say things that other people are upset or even offended by, right? But we're not going to say that every possible instance of offense is an occasion for regulating somebody else's speech, right? It doesn't sound like what A was saying to what Aaron was saying to Brian has anything to do with the classroom. Okay, he was just being an asshole. Brian left the room, but what was the effect of that speech?
Everybody else struggle.
Everybody else in the classroom was upset, and they had trouble learning. Okay? So what would we say is the difference between A and B, if there is a difference?
Openly antagonizing a single person.
Okay.
Versus, constructive criticism of religion.
Okay, so one way we might, okay, so in any case, don't look at the conclusion yet. Look at premise 1, right? Would we agree with that we should prohibit the students, or at least limit the student speech in the classroom abuse case, but not limit what students were saying in the lunchroom offense case? Okay, so Addie, your explanation is that in the former case, the speech was directed at a particular student and singled them out, but in the latter case, it wasn't directed at anybody. It was just somebody overheard something that other people were saying and they got offended. Okay? Okay? Okay, that might be one way to explain it. What might be another way? What am I most concerned about in this classroom? That you do what?
Respect each other?
Well, I want you to respect each other, but that's, yes, I mean, it's part,
Pay attention.
huh?
That you pay attention to.
Why do I want you to pay attention?
To understand.
To understand, and if you understand, you're doing what? You're learning, right? So I want this to be a meaningful learning environment, okay? Has Aaron's speech in the first case made it difficult for the classroom to be a meaningful learning environment? Yeah, I mean, Brian's not there anymore. He left, but everybody else is upset and can't pay attention. You know, they're probably thinking about what they're going to do after class, you know, who they should talk to, or what friend they're going to tell, or if they should go to the dean, or, you know, whatever it might be, okay? Or they just are thinking, I don't want to be in a class with that guy again. Something like that, okay? Does what happens in the second case have anything to do with an environment that's conducive to learning? No, and in fact, right, the sorts of stuff that the students say in that conversation are things that you might even hear in a classroom. And you might even say are things that you should expect to hear in a classroom in which you're learning things, right? You might encounter ideas or concepts or discussion of events that upset you, but that doesn't mean it's not. It's an environment that's not conducive to learning. Okay. And in any case, this student, you know, they could choose to absent themselves, but they choose not to. Right. So the conclusion was, schools should prohibit student speech if, but only if, doing so is necessary to promote equal opportunity for a safe learning environment. Okay. So premise 2 would be something like, the best explanation of the paradigm cases is that student speech should be limited if and only if doing so is necessary to promote an equal opportunity for a safe learning environment. Okay? That's something the students are denied in the first case. but the student who's offended is not denied in the second case. All right. So we'll do 5 and then we'll, what time is it?
10:42.
Okay, we might be done a couple minutes early unless I just can't shut up, which is possible. All right, paradigm cases here. Unwanted treatment. A hospitalized patient diagnosed with cancer decides to refuse chemotherapy. The patient has been given all the relevant information about the treatment options and has come to a decision after careful reflection on their options. The doctor begins the chemotherapy against the patient's wishes because they think the patient has made the wrong decision. Okay, so you have a doctor overriding a decision that a patient has made, a well-informed patient has made. Emergency C-section, second paradigm case. A patient comes into the emergency room unconscious and seriously injured. The patient is 8 months pregnant, and doctors determine that an emergency C-section is in the best interests of both the patient and the baby. Since the patient is unconscious and no family or friends can be found, the doctors perform an emergency C-section without the patient's consent. Okay, what are our judgments going to be about these two cases? They're going to be the same or different? Okay, which of these two these two cases where doctors are acting without patient's consent, which one would be permissible, which one would be impermissible?
Two's permissible, one's impermissible.
Okay, so the first one is impermissible, the second one is permissible. Okay? So that's what we would say. In unwanted treatment, the doctor acts wrongly or something like that. And in the emergency C-section, the non-consensual treatment is morally permissible, right? Both are cases of non-consensual treatment by the doctor. One is impermissible, the first one is impermissible, the second one is permissible. The best explanation of the cases in premise 1 is that a physician should always get informed consent for treatment unless the patient is incapable of giving consent. So a patient should always get informed consent for treatment unless the patient is incapable of giving their consent. Okay? And then in the second part of this moral IBE, that's going to be your first premise in the principal application argument, right? A physician should always get informed consent for treatment unless the patient is incapable of giving their consent. And it's the case that's at issue in this argument would be a case in which a physician has treated a patient without his or her consent, almost certainly. Okay, is this making sense? I think once we start seeing full IBE arguments and we work through those a bit, that'll help, and putting it all together will help you to better understand it. Okay, so for Wednesday, make sure you turn the homework in before class. Include these that we did in class together today. Include those on what you turn in, okay? But we'll just pick up with the next exercises after 11A on Wednesday, okay? All right, guys, have a good day. I'll see you then.